For decades, California defined what renewable energy looked like in America. It set the standards, built the infrastructure, attracted the capital. Solar wasn't just an industry there, it was part of the state's identity. But over the past 18 months, something fundamental has shifted. Texas now leads the nation in solar capacity additions, and the gap is widening every quarter. This isn't a temporary fluctuation or a statistical anomaly. Major manufacturers are relocating. Utility-scale projects that would have automatically gone to California are now breaking ground outside Houston and San Antonio. The investment flow has reversed, and most Americans haven't noticed yet. What happened isn't about one policy or one election. It's about how quickly economic gravity can shift when the conditions change. California's solar sector didn't collapse. It just stopped growing while Texas accelerated past it. And if you understand why that happened, you understand something crucial about where American energy, manufacturing, and economic power are actually moving right now. This is that explanation. The story begins not with Texas, but with California in the early 2000s. Back then, the state wasn't just experimenting with solar energy, it was engineering the entire framework that would define how America thought about renewable power. The California Solar Initiative launched in 2007 with over $3 billion in funding. It wasn't a symbolic gesture, it was infrastructure. It was policy architecture designed to create a permanent industry. Residential solar installations exploded. Commercial projects followed. By 2010, California had more installed solar capacity than the rest of the country combined. Investors understood that if you wanted to build a solar company in America, you built it in California. The regulatory environment was predictable. The state mandated renewable energy targets that utilities had to meet. There was clarity, and clarity attracts capital. But that same regulatory clarity came with complexity. California didn't just want solar panels on rooftops, it wanted them installed a certain way, inspected according to specific codes, interconnected through particular processes. The permitting systems grew dense. Environmental reviews, even for renewable projects, became lengthy. Labor requirements tightened. These weren't arbitrary obstacles. They reflected California's broader priorities around safety, environmental protection, and worker standards. But they added time. They added cost. And in an industry where margins were tightening and competition was intensifying, time and cost started to matter in ways they hadn't before. Texas, meanwhile, wasn't trying to build a solar industry at all. For most of the 2000s and into the early 2010s, Texas was oil and gas country. Solar was a curiosity, a niche interest for environmentalists and tech enthusiasts. The state had no renewable portfolio standards. There were no mandates forcing utilities to buy solar power. But Texas had something else: land, sun, and a wholesale electricity market that rewarded the cheapest power, no matter where it came from. And as solar technology improved and costs dropped, something unexpected happened. Solar started winning in Texas not because of subsidies or mandates, but because it became economically competitive on its own terms. The turning point came around 2019 and 2020. Solar panel prices had fallen dramatically worldwide due to manufacturing scale, mostly driven by Chinese production capacity. At the same time, battery storage technology was improving, which meant solar power could be stored and dispatched when needed, making it more valuable to grid operators. Texas utilities started looking at solar not as a political statement, but as a pragmatic choice. A utility-scale solar farm in West Texas could produce electricity cheaper than a new natural gas plant in many cases. And because Texas has its own independent grid, the famous ERCOT system, it could move quickly. Projects that might take 3 or 4 years to permit and build in California were getting approved and constructed in 18 months in Texas. Then came the federal policy shift. The Inflation Reduction Act passed in 2022 and expanded tax credits for renewable energy projects. But here's what mattered: The credits were structured to reward domestic manufacturing and projects in certain zones. Texas positioned itself aggressively to capture that investment. State officials, many of whom had spent their careers in the oil and gas sector, understood how to attract industrial capital. They streamlined permitting for solar farms the same way they had for drilling operations. They emphasized speed and certainty. California, by contrast, was dealing with growing pains. The state's grid operator was managing reliability concerns. There were political battles over transmission lines. Community opposition to large solar farms was rising in some regions, driven by concerns about agricultural land use and desert ecosystems. It's important to understand that California didn't stop building solar. The state added significant capacity every year. Rooftop solar continued to expand, but the rate of growth slowed, and more critically, the big utility-scale projects, the ones that move the needle on national rankings, started shifting to other states. Texas was the primary beneficiary, but Arizona, Nevada, and even Florida were picking up projects too. Developers started doing the math. If a project in California would take 4 years and face potential litigation from environmental groups or local opponents, but a comparable project in Texas could be operational in half that time, the choice became obvious. Capital flows to where it can generate returns fastest. The jobs followed the projects. Manufacturing facilities that might have located in California a decade ago were now choosing Texas. Solar panel assembly, inverter production, battery manufacturing, these weren't hypothetical jobs. They were real facilities employing real people. And once a manufacturing base starts to establish itself in a region, it creates momentum. Supply chains develop. Workforce training programs emerge. Local governments become invested in the industry's success. Texas began to build the kind of industrial ecosystem around solar that California had pioneered, but with lower costs and faster execution. There's a policy dimension here that's uncomfortable to discuss, but essential to understand. California's approach to solar was always intertwined with broader social and environmental goals. The state wanted solar power, but it also wanted good union jobs, strict environmental protections, community input processes, and equity considerations in how projects were sited and who benefited from them. These aren't unreasonable goals. Many would argue they're morally necessary, but they created friction. Every additional requirement, every additional review process, every additional stakeholder that needed to be consulted added time and uncertainty. Texas had none of that. A solar developer in Texas dealt with landowners, utilities, and a relatively streamlined state permitting process. It was faster, simpler, and cheaper. The net metering debate accelerated California's challenges. Net metering is the system that allows homeowners with solar panels to sell excess electricity back to the grid at retail rates. It was hugely popular and drove residential solar adoption, but utilities argued it was creating cost shifts, that people without solar were effectively subsidizing those with solar through higher rates. In 2022 and 2023, California regulators revised the net metering rules, reducing the compensation homeowners received for excess solar power. The solar industry fought the changes hard. They argued it would kill the residential market. And while installations didn't collapse, they did slow. Consumer enthusiasm cooled when the economic return diminished. Texas, meanwhile, didn't have this problem because Texas never built its residential solar market on net metering in the first place. It developed through different mechanisms, and large-scale solar didn't depend on residential policy at all. Then there's the political environment. California's government remained committed to renewable energy, but the state was also managing multiple crises simultaneously: housing costs, homelessness, water scarcity, wildfire risk, budget pressures. Solar policy wasn't always the top priority. Texas, conversely, saw solar as an economic development opportunity that aligned with its existing strengths. The state's political leadership, even those skeptical of climate policy, could support solar when it was framed as job creation and energy independence. That political simplicity mattered. Projects moved forward without the kind of ideological battles that sometimes slowed things in California. By 2024, the data was undeniable. Texas installed more new solar capacity than California for the second year running. The gap was widening. Investment announcements were increasingly centered on Texas and the broader Sun Belt. California still had more total installed capacity because of its head start, but Texas was catching up fast. And perhaps more significantly, the perception had shifted. When energy companies, investors, and manufacturers thought about where to build the next generation of solar infrastructure, Texas was now the default answer. California had become the legacy market, important, but no longer the frontier. There are consequences to this shift that extend beyond just solar panels and megawatts. California built significant parts of its economy and self-image around being the leader in clean technology. Silicon Valley wasn't just software, it was also clean tech venture capital, electric vehicles, battery innovation, and solar. Losing leadership in solar raises questions about whether California can maintain its position in other emerging industries. If the state's regulatory environment and cost structure make it difficult to scale physical industries like solar manufacturing, what does that mean for battery production, EV charging infrastructure, or green hydrogen? These are industries where speed and scale matter, where being able to build quickly and cheaply can determine whether you dominate a market or get left behind. The workforce implications are real too. Solar installation, maintenance, and manufacturing jobs are good middle-class jobs. They don't require advanced degrees. They offer pathways into skilled trades. When those jobs shift to other states, it's not just an economic loss, it's a social one. California's Central Valley, Inland Empire, and parts of the desert region had been developing solar-related employment. Some of that momentum has stalled. Young people training for careers in the solar industry are increasingly looking at opportunities in Texas, Arizona, and other states where the growth is happening. There's also a climate dimension that's harder to quantify but important. California's aggressive push on solar was always about more than just state energy policy. It was meant to demonstrate what was possible, to create models and technologies that other states and countries could adopt. When California led, it pulled national policy forward. It showed what worked and what didn't. If that leadership fades, if California becomes just another state with solar rather than the state that defines solar, the national conversation changes. Texas is building solar, but Texas isn't building solar as part of a comprehensive climate strategy. It's building solar because it's economically rational. That's not a criticism. Economic rationality is powerful, but it means the innovation and experimentation that California drove, the willingness to try new approaches even when they were expensive or uncertain, might diminish. What makes this situation particularly complex is that both states are succeeding by their own metrics. Texas is proving that renewable energy can thrive in a deregulated, market-driven environment with minimal government intervention beyond basic infrastructure support. California is maintaining high environmental and labor standards while still adding renewable capacity. But from a competitive standpoint, from the perspective of where capital and jobs flow, Texas is winning. And that's forcing California into an uncomfortable position. Does the state double down on its approach, accepting that it might grow more slowly, but in ways that align with its values? Or does it adapt, streamline, and try to compete more directly with Texas on speed and cost? There are no easy answers. California can't simply copy Texas. The two states have fundamentally different political cultures, regulatory traditions, and economic structures. What works in Texas wouldn't necessarily work in California, and vice versa. But California also can't ignore the fact that its model, however well-intentioned, is losing ground in practical terms. The state is facing a choice about what kind of leadership it wants to provide going forward. Does it want to be the place where the most solar gets built, or the place where solar gets built the right way, even if that means less of it and at a slower pace? Both are defensible positions, but they lead to very different outcomes. The federal government is watching this play out with interest. National energy policy is increasingly shaped by what's working at the state level. If Texas demonstrates that massive solar deployment can happen quickly and cheaply without extensive regulation, that influences how Congress and federal agencies think about nationwide policy. If California shows that high standards and slower growth still produce good outcomes, that matters too. But right now, the Texas model looks more replicable to other states. It's simpler, faster, and doesn't require the kind of political consensus and institutional capacity that California has built over decades. For Americans watching from outside these two states, this shift matters because it's not really about solar panels. It's about how America builds things now. It's about whether speed or thoroughness wins in the 21st century economy. It's about whether states with strong regulatory frameworks can compete with states that prioritize rapid execution. And it's about what we're willing to sacrifice to achieve our goals. Texas is sacrificing some environmental review and community input to build faster. California is sacrificing growth speed to maintain higher standards. Both trade-offs have costs. Both have benefits. But the market is delivering its verdict through investment flows and job creation. And right now, that verdict favors Texas. The solar industry shift from California to Texas isn't a crisis yet. California isn't collapsing. The state will remain important in renewable energy for years to come. But the trajectory is clear, and trajectories matter. They determine where industries center themselves, where innovation happens, where the next generation of workers builds careers. California pioneered American solar, built the initial industry, proved it could work. Texas is now scaling it, making it routine, turning it into just another part of the energy mix. That transition from pioneer to executor, from innovation to implementation, is profound. And it's happening quietly, in quarterly capacity reports and manufacturing site announcements that most people never see, until one day you look up and realize the center of gravity has moved. That day is approaching faster than most Americans realized.